Jackson Hale didn't move to the outskirts of the city for peace and quiet, though. In a way, that's what he got. His house sat on a hill where an old, private road wound like a snake through dense pine forest. Over the years, he had poured every dollar into securing his land and building his own fortress, high walls, cameras at hidden angles, and motion sensor lights that blinked to life whenever the wildlife wandered too close. For Jackson, the property was his escape and a shield. From what? He'd never say aloud, but he didn't need to. Men like him, men with years spent tiptoeing on the line of moral grayness, didn't just retire. They left things behind, unfinished and untidy, and those things had a habit of circling back like vultures. Jackson's fortune came from the kind of ventures you didn't talk about over dinner, under-the-table deals, problem-solving, and businesses that thrived in loopholes. He'd made his money, lost his conscience, and when it came time to disappear, he took that road out to the edge of nowhere and built himself a boundary no one could cross. Or so he thought. The first time Jackson saw the spikes, he didn't believe his eyes. It was close to midnight, and the only sound was the gravel crunching beneath his tires as he rounded the final curve toward home. He almost didn't notice them, thin black strips of metal lying innocently across the road just before the gates. But a flicker in his headlights betrayed them, the sharp tips glinting like jagged teeth. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching to a halt just a foot away. For a moment he sat there, his hand gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make it creak, staring at the spikes like they were some mirage his tired brain had conjured. But they were very real, crude-looking, industrial-grade tire spikes hammered into the ground, with a precision that made his stomach twist. He turned off the ignition and stepped out of the car, the heavy night air pressing against his chest. His boots crunched against the gravel as he crouched to inspect the metal. They were anchored deep, deliberately placed. Someone had planned this, and worse, someone had been here. Jackson straightened and scanned the forest on either side of the road. Darkness stared back at him, vast and impenetrable. His eyes lingered on the tree line, searching for movement, but the woods were silent. Too silent. His lights illuminated only the edges of the trees, their branches drooping under the weight of the darkness. He knew every inch of his property. No one could get this close without setting off the alarms or tripping one of his carefully laid deterrents. Yet here they were, these spikes, like some kind of challenge. Jackson Hale didn't take kindly to challenges. It took him an hour to pry the spikes free. He worked silently, sweat beading on his brow as his tools clanged against metal. When the last piece came loose, he hurled it into the brush, his breath heavy with frustration. He left the road scarred and uneven, but clear. By the time he closed the gate behind him, locking it with an audible clunk, he'd convinced himself that it was nothing, probably a prank. Maybe some pissed-off neighbors, he thought. The people in the HOA had always been a thorn in his side, complaining about his property being an eyesore or about his refusal to participate in their ridiculous rules. Jackson didn't care. He didn't attend their meetings or answer their letters. He had no HOA contracts or dues to pay. His road was his road, legally purchased along with the property years ago, and no one could tell him what to do with it. But even as he tried to put the incident out of his mind, a small voice gnawed at him. Someone was testing him. The next morning, Jackson found the envelope tucked into his gate. It was thick paper, cream-colored with embossed lettering at the top, Homeowners Association. He snorted and tore it open, scanning the page with growing incredulity. Unauthorized removal of HOA installed safety infrastructure. A fine of $1,000 has been issued under Section 17 billion of Community Compliance Regulations. Repeat offenses may result in legal action. Jackson reread the letter twice. Safety infrastructure? Was this a joke? He crumpled the paper in his fist and tossed it into the cab of his truck. He didn't have time for games, but by afternoon the spikes were back. This time they were driven even deeper, and the heads were painted dark to blend into the gravel. Jackson stood over them, seething. He knew what this was now, control. HOA had overstepped before, fining him for things that didn't apply to him: tall grass along the perimeter of his fence, a shed that wasn't aesthetically compliant, mailboxes painted the wrong shade of beige. He'd ignored every notice, sure they'd get tired of poking the bear. But this This was different. They were on his road, his property. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and threw long shadows across the yard, Jackson sat on his porch and watched the road like a hawk. A cigarette smoldered between his fingers as his mind churned. How had they done it? Who was coming onto his land? Cameras covered his house and the surrounding property, but the road, long and winding as it was, remained a blind spot. Jackson always figured it was too far out for anyone to bother. He ground the cigarette out on the wooden railing, his jaw tightening. If they wanted a fight, they'd pick the wrong man. But that night, something shifted. Around 2 a.m., Jackson woke to a sound he couldn't quite place, a dull metallic scrape, faint but distinct. He moved quietly, slipping out of bed and grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. The house was dark, save for the pale light of the moon filtering through the windows. Outside, the trees swayed, casting jittery shadows against the ground. Jackson crept to the edge of the porch and waited. Then he heard it again, a scrape, followed by a faint clink. His flashlight snapped on, cutting a beam across the road, but there was nothing. Just an empty stretch of gravel. Jackson swept the light back and forth, heart thudding in his chest. For the first time in years, a flicker of unease wormed its way into his gut. Someone was out there, just beyond the reach of the light, watching, waiting. He stepped off the porch, gripping the flashlight like a weapon as he stalked toward the road. Whatever this was, it wasn't a prank anymore. And whoever they were about to find out how dangerous it was to provoke a man like Jackson Hale. Jackson awoke to the jarring sound of metal scraping against metal. The noise slashed through the quiet dawn like a serrated blade, vibrating in his skull. It was faint, carried by the wind and filtered through his double-paned windows, but unmistakable. He shot up from bed, heart pounding, reaching instinctively for the heavy flashlight he now kept beside him. Still groggy, he paused, straining to hear. Silence settled again, heavy and oppressive. But Jackson knew what he'd heard wasn't just in his head. Someone or something was out there. He didn't bother throwing on a coat. Stepping onto the porch in a t-shirt, sweatpants, and boots, the cold morning air bit at his skin, but he ignored it. A thin fog crept along the edge of the treeline, twisting like tendrils across the road. It gave everything an eerie, distorted quality. Jackson aimed his flashlight toward the gravel stretch leading to his gate, and there they were. The spikes were back. This time they were different. Jackson stepped closer, boots crunching the frost-dusted ground, and crouched to get a better look. Unlike before, the spikes were no longer thin black strips tossed haphazardly across the gravel. These were welded into metal plates, polished to a sinister gleam, their razor-sharp tips pointing upward like the jaws of a trap. They had been drilled and secured into the ground with industrial bolts. Someone had taken their time, meticulously working under cover of night while Jackson slept. His jaw clenched as the realization washed over him. They weren't just provoking him now. This was war. Wah. His flashlight swept across the road and landed on a sign planted just beyond the spikes. It hadn't been there yesterday. A professionally made placard, staked into the earth with surgical precision, declared in bold white letters, "Private Road HOA Safety Installation. Tampering is a criminal offense." Jackson exhaled sharply, his breath steaming in the cold air. The audacity of it almost made him laugh. HOA Safety Installation. Who did they think they were fooling? This wasn't a safety measure, this was a land grab. A power play. He could practically hear the smug voice of Ellie Crawford, HOA's president, reading the fine print of some archaic bylaw as if it justified invading his property. Jackson had seen it all before, petty tyrants using rules as weapons, bending and twisting them to get what they wanted. But HOA had made a grave mistake. They underestimated him. Jackson retrieved a crowbar from his garage and got to work. It wasn't easy. These spikes were anchored deep, bolted down to resist removal. He struggled against the metal, grunting as his muscles strained with each pull. By the time he pried the first plate loose, the sun had risen, and Jackson's breath came in labored bursts. Sweat mixed with the cold air, chilling him to the bone, but he kept going, ripping up plate after plate until the road was once again clear. His palms were raw, his back aching, but a sharp satisfaction settled in his chest. As he tossed the last plate into the ditch, Jackson noticed something strange beneath the gravel where the spikes had been embedded, thin wires snaking through the earth, leading toward the tree line. He frowned, brushing away more of the gravel with his fingers. The wires were old, frayed in some spots, but they seemed to disappear into the underbrush, buried just out of view. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to make this happen, and Jackson was starting to wonder just how deep this hole went. That's when the engine noise started. A car was coming. Jackson turned his head sharply, spotting the familiar shimmer of a black SUV rolling up the road toward his gate. It was HOA again. He knew it without even seeing the tinted windows or Ellie Crawford's smug expression behind the wheel. Sure enough, as the vehicle stopped, Ellie stepped out, dressed as impeccably as always, a crisp beige blazer, a pencil skirt, and that ever-present smile of hers too wide to be sincere, too sharp to be comforting. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," Ellie called, her voice syrupy with condescension. Jackson leaned on the crowbar, his chest heaving slightly from exertion. "Ellie," he said flatly. She gestured to the torn-up road and the ditch now littered with metal plates. "It seems you've been busy. Your people put this crap on my road." Jackson's voice was low, simmering with restrained fury. "Without my permission." Ellie skeked softly, shaking her head. "Mr. Hale, as you know, the HOA has a responsibility to ensure the safety of all residents in the area. Several complaints were filed about your road, the speed, the lack of regulation. It was decided that safety measures were necessary to protect the community." "Community?" Jackson barked a bitter laugh. "What community? This is my land, my road. I've got the deed, Ellie, and you damn well know it." Ellie's smile didn't waver. "With all due respect, Mr. Hale, we've already filed an adjustment to your property boundaries. The HOA has claimed jurisdiction over this road as part of the larger development." Jackson's hands gripped the crowbar tighter. "That's theft. It's regulation." Her tone hardened just slightly. "And I'd advise you to tread carefully. Destroying HOA property is a violation that carries significant fines. Removing those spikes could be interpreted as vandalism or, worse, obstruction of safety protocols. Do you really want to escalate this?" Jackson stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Ellie's smile faltered for the briefest second as he loomed over her, the crowbar dangling loosely in his hand. "You tell whoever's behind this that if they come onto my property again, there won't be a next time." Ellie's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, all pretense of politeness slipped away. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, almost threateningly, "you really should consider cooperating. It would make things easier." Jackson didn't answer. He simply turned and walked back toward his house, leaving Ellie and her SUV idling by the gate. As he disappeared behind the door, he glanced at the cameras mounted along his porch. The footage was clear, capturing every word, every movement. Inside, Jackson poured himself a cup of black coffee, his hands still trembling slightly with anger. He stared out the window toward the now empty road, Ellie's words echoing in his mind. Cooperating would make things easier. That wasn't a warning. That was a threat. And Jackson Hale didn't take kindly to threats. He set the coffee down and reached for his phone. If Ellie thought she could outmaneuver him, she was in for a surprise. Jackson didn't play fair, not then, not now. And he wasn't about to let anyone take what was his. Jackson spent the rest of the day reinforcing his boundaries. He didn't trust Ellie Crawford, nor did he believe her flimsy explanations about safety protocols and community concerns. The plates, the spikes, and the wires, they weren't installed to protect anyone. It was an act of deliberate intimidation. The HOA didn't want Jackson to cooperate. They wanted him to submit. And that was something he simply wasn't capable of. By mid-afternoon, Jackson had driven the battered remains of the metal plates to the far edge of his property and dumped them into an old ravine. If Ellie or her cronies planned to return for their hardware, they'd need to wade through bramble and mud to get it back. He'd made sure the spike traps were gone for good, but his gut told him this was only the beginning. People like Ellie never backed off after the first push. They doubled down. That suspicion was confirmed at exactly 4 a.m. when Jackson's alarm started screaming. The noise jolted him out of bed, a harsh, mechanical wail that echoed through the house. He grabbed his flashlight and shotgun, moving with practiced speed toward the control panel. The motion sensors near the gate were flashing red. Someone was there. Jackson checked the live feed from his cameras and froze. 3 figures in dark clothes stood by the gate. They were working quickly, using tools to bolt something back onto the road. One of them crouched with a cordless drill, sparks flaring as he drove screws into the gravel. Another watched the tree line, head on a swivel, while the third planted a new sign in the dirt. Jackson's eyes narrowed as he zoomed in on the lettering. HOA installation zone, private access restricted. Trespassing will result in legal action. For a moment, Jackson simply stared at the screen, the shotgun heavy in his hands. The audacity of it all. These weren't pranksters or vandals, these were professionals. The way they moved, the way they kept watch, it was clear they'd done this before. Ellie had sent a crew to undo his work, and they were counting on him sleeping through it. Not tonight. Jackson threw on a coat and stepped outside into the freezing dark, the shotgun slung over his shoulder. The forest was silent except for the hum of their drill, and the pale moonlight reflected faintly off the bolts they'd already secured into the road. He stayed in the shadows as he approached, moving down the slight incline toward the gate. One of the men turned abruptly, as if sensing something, and shined a flashlight toward the trees. Jackson froze behind a thick pine, holding his breath until the beam passed over him and moved on. Almost done, the man with the drill muttered. His voice carried in the still air. "Good. I don't want to be here all night," another answered. "She said this guy's a lunatic." Jackson's lip curled. So they were scared of him. Good. He moved closer, silent and steady, until he was just beyond the edge of the clearing. Then, with deliberate slowness, he stepped out of the shadows. "You boys lost?" The flashlight whipped toward him, blinding for a split second before one of them shouted, "Who the hell?" "Drop the tools." Jackson's voice was calm, even. He leveled the shotgun across his chest, not aiming, not yet, but making it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "You've got 10 seconds to pack your toys and get off my property." The man with the flashlight hesitated, glancing toward his partner. "We're with the HOA." "I don't give a damn if you're with the FBI," Jackson interrupted. "You're trespassing. Now get out." One of them, younger, cockier, stepped forward with his hands raised. "Hey, easy there, buddy. We're just doing our jobs. No need for." Jackson chambered around with a mechanical clack, and the sound silenced him mid-sentence. "You're down to 5 seconds." The men looked at each other, realizing he wasn't bluffing. The one with the drill dropped it, the tool clattering against the gravel. All right, he said, backing away. "We're going." "Take the sign with you," Jackson added. "And tell Ellie Crawford that if she sends anyone else onto my land, they won't walk out so easy next time." They scrambled to gather their tools, ripping the freshly planted sign from the dirt. Jackson watched as they piled into a black truck parked just outside the gate and sped off, tires kicking up gravel. The rumble of the engine faded into the distance, leaving Jackson alone in the cold. He stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. His road was scarred again, littered with half-secured bolts and tools left behind in their hurry to escape. It was a mess, but it was his mess. And for now, it was clear. Jackson turned back toward the house, knowing this wasn't over. Ellie wouldn't take this loss lying down. If anything, it would embolden her. People like Ellie didn't know when to stop, and that's what made them dangerous. Sure enough, the next morning, Jackson found a legal notice taped to his gate. It was thick, printed on the same fancy stationery as before, and it reeked of petty authority. Notice of violation, it began, and went on to accuse Jackson of obstructing HOA operations, interfering with safety infrastructure, and threatening association contractors. Fines were listed absurd sums that totaled nearly $10,000. At the bottom, in perfect cursive, Ellie Crawford's signature smirked up at him like a challenge. Jackson crumpled the letter and tossed it aside. Fines meant nothing to him. They couldn't touch his land with money alone, and he knew Ellie didn't have the legal right to install those spikes in the first place. But it wasn't about the fines. It wasn't even about the spikes. It was about control, about testing him, pushing him until he either submitted or lashed out. and Jackson had no intention of giving her the satisfaction of either. That night, Jackson sat on his porch with a bottle of whiskey and watched the road. The forest was quiet, the moon casting long shadows across the clearing. His shotgun rested against the wall beside him, loaded and ready. Ellie thought she could outsmart him, thought she could intimidate him with her petty rules and her hired thugs. But she'd made a critical mistake. She'd come onto his land and declared war without knowing what kind of man she was up against. Jackson Hale wasn't afraid of people like Ellie Crawford. He'd dealt with worse in his lifetime: sharks in expensive suits, grifters who smiled as they gutted you for everything you were worth. Compared to them, Ellie was just another pretender with a clipboard and a superiority complex. But there was something more to this. The wires, the tools, the way her men had worked and practiced silence, it felt orchestrated, calculated. This wasn't just about HOA greed, something else was at play here. As he sat there, staring at the darkened road, Jackson made himself a promise. If Ellie wanted a fight, he'd give her one. But he wouldn't just fight back, he'd burn her operation to the ground. Whatever game she was playing, whatever power she thought she held, Jackson Hale was going to take it all away from her piece by piece. And then he'd make her regret ever stepping onto his land. Jackson knew the men would return, but what unsettled him most was how quickly they worked, like clockwork. Ellie Crawford had connections. That much was certain. But her precision, the calculated movements of her hired hands, was the mark of something bigger. These weren't overeager HOA enforcers slapping fines on residents for having unapproved flowers in their yard. This was systematic. He spent the next day combing through his property, determined to uncover whatever Ellie thought she owned. His boots sank into frost-coated earth as he followed the same thin wires he had discovered beneath the gravel where the spikes had been anchored. With a small spade in hand, he dug carefully, unraveling the line like a spider's web. After 20 minutes, the wires led him to something that made his blood run cold. A small, metallic device, partially buried in a shallow trench beneath the foliage. It was no bigger than a shoebox, dark gray with the faint hum of active electronics. The logo stamped on the surface was one he hadn't seen in years: CCI. Technologies. Son of a bitch, Jackson muttered under his breath. CCI wasn't your run-of-the-mill tech supplier. Years ago, back when Jackson still ran with less than reputable crowds, they'd been at the center of a corporate surveillance scandal, installing safety equipment in private areas that doubled as monitoring systems. Their reach was far, their hands greased with enough money to bury lawsuits before they saw the light of day. Jackson had a sinking feeling that the wires and the devices weren't just about installing spikes to slow traffic. This was surveillance. He carried the device back to his garage, slamming it onto the workbench under the flickering overhead bulb. There was no obvious way to open it, no screws, no panels. Whoever had built it made sure it wasn't something you could take apart with a screwdriver. He turned it over, inspecting every inch, and that's when he noticed the faint blinking light beneath the casing, a red LED pulsing like a heartbeat. Jackson frowned. GPS tracker. They'd been watching him. "You want to play games, Ellie?" Jackson growled, his voice a low rumble in the silence of the garage. "Fine. Let's play." With a pair of wire cutters and a roll of industrial tape, Jackson rigged the device. He took his truck, drove 10 miles into town, and stopped beneath an overpass. There, he tucked the device beneath the axle of a rusted-out van that hadn't moved in years, its tires sunken and windows covered in grime. If Ellie's people wanted to follow his movements, they'd get a hell of a surprise trying to track him through abandoned lots and junkyards. That night, Jackson sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee, eyes fixed on the road. His cameras were running, motion sensors armed. If Ellie sent her men again, he'd be ready. But by midnight, the forest remained silent, the road untouched. No SUVs rolled up to his gate. No sparks from drills lit the darkness. It was almost disappointing. Jackson had been spoiling for a fight. The next morning, a letter arrived. It wasn't taped to the gate this time. The envelope sat neatly in his mailbox, hand-delivered by someone who had been bold enough to step onto his property unnoticed. The paper inside was heavier than usual, embossed with gold HOA lettering. Jackson skimmed the contents, his jaw tightening with every line. Notice of legal action. By failure to comply with HOA safety standards and regulations, and by engaging in destruction of community property, the association has filed an emergency injunction for restricted access to your property under Section 18C of Regional Development Law. Further failure to comply will result in foreclosure proceedings. Jackson's hands crumpled the letter before he could stop himself. Foreclosure? On his property? The audacity of it stunned him, even knowing how far Ellie was willing to go. But this wasn't just Ellie anymore. The involvement of CCI. Technologies confirmed what Jackson had suspected. This was bigger than HOA politics. Someone wanted his land. He needed leverage. Jackson didn't waste time. He loaded up his truck with equipment, bolt cutters, floodlights, even an old hunting rifle he hadn't touched in years, and headed back to the tree line where the device had been buried. If CCI had been careless enough to leave one wire uncovered, there had to be more. Sure enough, an hour of digging revealed a network of cables stretching deeper into his property, leading farther up the ridge. When Jackson finally reached the end of the line, his breath caught. Tucked into a clearing hidden from view, surrounded by trees on all sides, sat a small steel utility shed, its exterior painted dark to blend with the forest. A thick padlock secured the double doors, and no markings gave away its purpose. Jackson crouched low, inspecting the ground around the shed. Fresh tire tracks. Someone had been here recently. Whatever was inside the shed wasn't supposed to be found. He stood, rolling his shoulders, and gripped the bolt cutters. Let's see what's so damn important. The padlock snapped with a metallic crack, and Jackson pushed the doors open. The interior was Spartan, lit only by the pale glow of a single monitor mounted on a metal desk. It displayed a map of his property, his road, and several marked areas highlighted in red. Cameras. Microphones. The entire ridge had been wired for surveillance, and judging by the timestamp on the feed, they were still live. Jackson's pulse hammered as he leaned closer, scanning the data on the screen. Ellie hadn't just been watching him, they'd been mapping his movements, cataloging every corner of his property. And then he saw something that made his blood freeze, a blinking red dot near the edge of his house. Someone was there, right now. Jackson bolted back to his truck, adrenaline surging through him as he sped down the ridge, tires skidding across the gravel. When his house came into view, he saw the flash of movement near the garage, a figure dressed in black disappearing around the corner. Jackson slammed on the brakes, jumped out, and raised the rifle. Get the hell off my property. The figure didn't stop. Jackson fired a warning shot into the ground, the sharp crack of the rifle echoing through the trees. This time, the figure froze. Slowly, they turned, raising their hands in surrender. Jackson advanced cautiously, keeping the rifle trained on them as the floodlights kicked on, illuminating the intruder's face. It wasn't one of Ellie's goons. It was a young woman, no older than 30, with dark hair pulled back into a braid. She wore black cargo pants and a tactical jacket, but there was no malice in her expression, only exhaustion. "Don't shoot," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Then why the hell are you sneaking around my house?" Jackson growled. The woman lowered her hands slightly. "Because you're in danger, Mr. Hale. They're not going to stop until they take everything you have. And if you don't listen to me, you're going to lose this fight." Jackson stared at her, the rifle still raised, every instinct telling him not to trust her. But something in her tone, the quiet urgency, the hint of fear she tried to hide, gave him pause. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. She hesitated, then said, "My name's Kara. I used to work for CCI. I know what they're doing, and I know how to stop it." For the first time in weeks, Jackson felt his certainty waver. He didn't trust her, but he couldn't ignore the weight of her words. If she was telling the truth, then this wasn't just about HOA greed or petty fines. It was something far worse, and it was coming for him. Jackson didn't lower the rifle. The woman, Kara, if that was even her real name, held her ground, hands still raised in what felt like a rehearsed show of compliance. She was calm, too calm for someone staring down the barrel of a loaded gun, and that fact gnawed at him. The floodlights cast stark shadows across her face, highlighting sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that betrayed no fear. She was either brave, reckless, or exactly the kind of trouble he didn't need. "You've got 30 seconds to explain what the hell you're doing here," Jackson said, his voice low and flat. "Then I'm calling the sheriff." "If the sheriff was going to help you, they'd have done it by now," Kara replied. "You've noticed, haven't you? How they don't show up when HOA calls, but they're here the second you push back. Someone's bought them, Mr. Hale. And it's not Ellie Crawford versus CCI. She's just their pawn." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "What do you know about CCI?" "I worked for them for 3 years," Kara said quickly, seizing on his hesitation. "They're not just a tech company. They specialize in surveillance, acquisition, and control. They partner with homeowner associations to upgrade neighborhoods, but the upgrades are a smokescreen. They use HOA bylaws to get what they really want: land, leverage, and compliance. Your property isn't just valuable because of its size. It's what's underneath it." "Underneath?" Jackson frowned. Kara gestured toward the house, her hands still hovering cautiously midair. "Can we talk inside?" "Out here, we might as well be on camera." For a moment, Jackson considered just turning her in, handing her off to whatever crooked sheriff showed up next. But something about her rang true, even if he hated to admit it. He'd spent his life reading people trusting his gut when others second-guessed theirs, and his gut told him Kara wasn't lying, at least not about the important parts. He stepped back and jerked his head toward the porch. "Move." Kara walked ahead of him, careful to keep her hands where he could see them. Inside, Jackson locked the door and killed the floodlights, plunging the room into darkness, except for the faint glow of his security monitors. He watched her eyes flicker to the screens. "They've been here more than you realize," she murmured. "Start talking," Jackson ordered, setting the rifle down within reach. Kara exhaled slowly, rubbing her hands together as if she could coax warmth back into them. Months ago, CCI began surveying areas like this: rural properties, private roads, land outside major developments. They're looking for prime locations to expand something they call Project Grid, a pilot program that combines surveillance and infrastructure control. Think private roads that can be locked down remotely, underground access points for utilities, properties that can be repurposed for high-value contracts. "You're saying they want my land for infrastructure." "Not just infrastructure," she corrected. "They think there's an underground water source here, a natural aquifer. Fresh water is a gold mine in today's market. If they control access to it, they control everything around it. Ellie Crawford's HOA is just a tool. They feed her promises of profit and development, and she does their dirty work. Fines, foreclosure threats, forced compliance. It's a playbook I've seen before." Jackson ran a hand over his jaw, the pieces clicking together in his mind like tumblers in a lock. He thought of the buried cables, the shed in the woods, the precise placement of the spikes. This wasn't some arbitrary flex of power --C.C. I had been working toward this for months, maybe longer. And Ellie, smug and self-satisfied, probably thought she was in charge when she was little more than a pawn herself. "How do you know all this?" Jackson asked. Kara hesitated, then said, "I quit when I realized what they were doing, but not before I took files, maps, contracts, names of their clients. I knew I couldn't stop them alone, but someone like you're exactly the kind of problem they don't know how to handle." Jackson almost laughed at that. "You've got a hell of a lot of faith in someone you just met." "Not faith," she said, meeting his eyes. Desperation. Before he could respond, one of the monitors flickered, drawing his attention. The camera feed for the western perimeter had gone black. Jackson leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "Damn it!" "What is it?" Kara asked sharply. "Someone's here." Jackson grabbed the rifle, flicking off the safety as he stalked toward the back door. Kara followed close behind, a tense shadow at his heels. Outside, the night was unnervingly quiet. The forest pressed in like a wall of darkness, and the air smelled faintly of smoke. Jackson's flashlight cut a narrow beam through the trees as he moved toward the broken camera. When he reached it, the housing was smashed, wires dangling like severed veins. Jackson crouched to inspect the damage, and that's when he noticed the footprints: heavy, deliberate tracks leading deeper into the woods. "They're watching us," Kara whispered. Jackson rose, scanning the darkness with narrowed eyes. Let him watch. They're not ready for what happens next. But the next move wasn't his. It was theirs. When they returned to the house, Jackson saw it immediately. The front door had been forced open. A cold dread settled in his chest. He stepped inside, rifle raised, and swept the room. Papers were scattered across the floor. Cabinet doors hung open. His tools, his files, his life had been rifled through like trash. Kara picked up one of the envelopes from the floor and held it up to the light. They were looking for something. Jackson didn't respond. His gaze fell on the table near the window, where a burning matchbook smoldered against a stack of his records. He crossed the room in 2 strides, stamping it out before the fire could spread. The matchbook was from a bar in town, a place Jackson hadn't set foot in for years. Scrawled across the inside cover were 3 words in neat, block letters. "Get out now, Duro." Kara stared at it, then looked back at Jackson. "They're giving you a chance to run." Jackson crushed the matchbook in his fist. "I don't run." "Then you better be ready to fight," Kara said grimly. Over the next few hours, Jackson turned his house into a fortress. Every remaining camera was recalibrated, motion sensors replaced, and floodlights wrangled to cover the blind spots. Kara helped him, working silently and efficiently, her presence oddly reassuring despite the circumstances. By dawn, the property looked like a war zone in waiting. As Jackson locked the gate and stared down the empty road, he thought about the people behind this, the suits and boardrooms, the smug executives who saw his land as numbers on a ledger. They didn't know him. They didn't know what he was capable of. Ellie Crawford might have been their puppet, but she'd made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated him. And Jackson Hale didn't lose battles. The morning air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that felt like the world was holding its breath. Jackson stood at the edge of his porch, his shotgun resting against his shoulder as he stared down the long, winding road that led to his gate. The land felt different now, violated, almost as if it could sense the encroaching threat. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't some old ghost of his past life rearing its head. This was real, orchestrated, and deliberate. The events of the past few days had unraveled his patience thread by thread. First the spikes, then the devices, and now the house break-in with its not-so-subtle message to get out. CCI and Ellie Crawford's HOA hadn't just tried to intimidate him, they were declaring war. Jackson had fortified his home, turning the property into a fortress of wires, lights, and steel, but deep down, he knew that wouldn't stop them. People like Ellie and the men she worked for didn't operate in half measures. If they wanted his land, they wouldn't ask again. Kara sat on the steps beside him, tying back her dark hair and checking the magazine of a small pistol she'd pulled from her pack. She'd spent the night mapping out every blind spot around the property, pointing out where she thought they'd hit first. Jackson hadn't asked where she learned to do any of it. He didn't care. "They'll come at sunrise," Kara said finally, breaking the silence. "It's what they do, hit hard and fast while you're tired and distracted." Jackson glanced at the sky. A faint strip of pale gold crept over the horizon. Then they're already late. A sudden crack rang out in the distance, sharp and unmistakable gunfire. Jackson's instincts kicked in immediately. "Get inside," he snapped, grabbing Kara's arm and pulling her toward the door. They barely made it inside when a second shot echoed through the trees, this time closer, followed by the low rumble of tires. Jackson dropped to a crouch near the window and peered out. 2 black SUVs were rolling up the gravel road toward his gate, their headlights cutting through the thin mist. Behind them came a large, boxy truck, industrial, heavy-duty, the kind of vehicle used to haul construction equipment, or worse. His gut told him it was worse. "CCI?" Kara whispered, crouched beside him. "Who else?" Jackson muttered. He grabbed his rifle, the weight of it familiar and comforting. "Stay low. They're not here to talk." The SUVs stopped just short of the gate. Jackson could see figures in dark tactical gear dismounting, moving with the precision of hired mercenaries. These weren't Ellie's HOA thugs anymore. These were professionals. One of them approached the gate with a pair of bolt cutters, slicing through the lock with practiced ease. The heavy clang of metal hitting the ground echoed across the property. "Here we go," Jackson murmured, his pulse steady despite the chaos unfolding outside. The mercenaries poured through the gate, weapons in hand, fanning out as they advanced toward the house. Jackson took a deep breath and aimed through the narrow slit of an open window. He fired a single shot, the crack of the rifle deafening in the small room. One of the men dropped instantly, his weapon clattering to the ground. The others scattered for cover, shouting orders to each other. "They're splitting up," Kara said, watching from another window. "Some are flanking left." Jackson moved quickly, reloading as he sprinted toward the back of the house. He could hear the thud of boots on the ground, the creak of branches snapping underfoot. For a moment, he thought about his old life, those years spent outsmarting bigger fish, surviving when he had no right to. It felt like every lesson he'd ever learned, every dirty trick he'd ever played, had been leading to this moment. The first man came around the corner of the house, crouched low with his weapon raised. Jackson didn't hesitate. He stepped out and swung the butt of his rifle into the man's face, the impact sending him sprawling to the ground. Another figure appeared behind him, but Kara fired 2 clean shots from the back door, dropping the second man before he could react. "This isn't sustainable," Kara hissed, reloading her pistol. "There are too many of them." Jackson knew she was right. He'd picked a fight he couldn't win alone, but damned if he was going to let these bastards take his land without paying a price. "We'll draw them into the woods," he said. "I've got traps, set wires, pits. They won't be ready for it." They moved quickly, darting through the back door and into the cover of the trees. Jackson knew the land better than anyone, every dip and rise, every fallen log and shadowed clearing. He led Kara deeper into the woods, weaving between the trees as the sound of gunfire and shouting echoed behind them. One of the mercenaries triggered a tripwire, and an explosion of light erupted as a homemade flashbang went off, disorienting the group. Jackson used the distraction to pick off 2 more men, his rifle steady and deliberate. These professionals were good, but they weren't used to fighting someone on his own turf. "Where's the truck?" Kara asked, her voice sharp with urgency. Jackson scanned the tree lane and spotted the large vehicle still parked at the gate, its back doors open. Something about it didn't sit right with him. "They're not just here for us," he realized. "They're here for whatever's underground." The realization hit him like a hammer. This wasn't a siege, it was an extraction. The water source Kara mentioned, the aquifer beneath his land --C.C. I wasn't waiting to win this fight through legal channels. They were taking it by force. Jackson's grip tightened on the rifle. "We end this now." He sprinted toward the truck, Kara at his side. Bullets kicked up dirt around them, splintering branches and punching into the ground. Jackson didn't stop. He reached the truck, climbed into the cab, and found the ignition already running. They'd left it idling, probably assuming the property would be cleared within minutes. "Get clear," Jackson shouted at Kara, who dove behind a nearby tree. He jammed the gear shift into drive, slammed his foot onto the accelerator, and sent the truck barreling forward. It smashed through the broken gate with a metallic screech, skidding across the gravel road before Jackson aimed it toward the edge of the ravine. He jumped from the cab just as the truck hurtled over the edge, tumbling downward in a cascade of metal and dirt. The sound of its impact was thunderous, followed by the deep, concussive boom of an explosion as whatever equipment they'd stored inside ignited on impact. Fire erupted from the ravine, smoke billowing into the sky. The remaining mercenaries froze, their plan in ruins. Jackson stepped into view, rifle in hand, silhouetted against the blaze. "Get off my land," he growled, his voice carrying through the clearing like a final warning. One by one, the mercenaries retreated, disappearing into the smoke and trees. The battle was over, but Jackson knew the war was far from won. Ellie and CC would come back, he was certain of that, but next time they wouldn't catch him off guard. Kara emerged from the woods, covered in dirt and sweat. She stared at Jackson, her expression unreadable. "You just declared war on a corporation, you know that?" Jackson exhaled, the weight of it all settling onto his shoulders. "Yeah," he said quietly, "and I'm just getting started." The sun hung low in the sky as Jackson Hale sat on the edge of his porch, the faint smell of smoke still lingering in the cold air. The clearing looked like a battlefield, charred earth near the ravine, where the truck had exploded, shattered pieces of metal scattered like shrapnel, and the broken remnants of his gate hanging uselessly on twisted hinges. The forest beyond remained quiet, the silence no longer comforting but heavy, like the world itself was waiting for the next blow. He ran a hand over the stubble on his face, feeling the exhaustion settle deep in his bones. The mercenaries were gone, at least for now. After the explosion they'd scattered, retreating like wolves that knew they'd picked the wrong prey. Jackson had seen their kind before hired hands who valued a paycheck over loyalty. They didn't come back when the cost outweighed the reward. But CCI wasn't done with him. Not yet. "You know this isn't over," Kara said softly. She was leaning against the porch railing, her dark hair falling loose around her face, streaked with dirt and sweat. There was something unreadable in her expression, admiration, maybe, mixed with a sadness she tried to hide. Jackson nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the road where the black SUVs had disappeared hours earlier. "They'll regroup. Try again with lawyers, contracts, and fine print. Next time it'll be a suit at my door, not a gun." "Then what's your plan?" Kara asked. Jackson didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled matchbook they'd found during the break-in. "Get out now." It still read in those neat, deliberate letters. Jackson turned it over in his fingers, the paper worn and smudged, a reminder of the warning he'd ignored. Someone inside CCA had tried to tip him off, to save him from all this. But Jackson wasn't the kind of man who ran. He never had been. "They underestimated me," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "People like Ellie Crawford, and the suits she works for, they think they can take whatever they want. They hide behind legalese, hire muscle to do their dirty work, and count on people folding when they push hard enough." He glanced at Kara, his gaze hard. "But I don't fold." Kara studied him for a long moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "They'll come back with more resources, more pressure. They'll keep pushing until you're blood dry or locked up." "Let them try," Jackson said. He stood, stretching out his shoulders as he looked toward the broken gate. The fire in the ravine had burned itself out, leaving behind a scar of scorched earth. It wasn't pretty, but it was his. His land, his road, his fight. They hadn't taken that from him yet. The faint rumble of an engine broke the quiet. Jackson turned his head sharply as a battered white pickup truck appeared at the edge of the property, crawling up the gravel road. Kara tensed, her hand moving instinctively toward the pistol tucked into her waistband, but Jackson shook his head. "Easy." The truck rolled to a stop, and the door creaked open. An older man stepped out, his boots kicking up dust as he walked. Jackson recognized him instantly. Harvey Tucker, one of the oldest residents in the area, a man who'd lived here longer than any HOA ever existed. He was a quiet type, kept to himself, but Jackson had always respected him. Harvey took a long look at the destruction before turning his gaze to Jackson. "Busy morning?" Harvey drawled, pulling a worn cap off his head and wiping his brow. "You could say that," Jackson replied. Harvey nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on the blackened dirt and the shattered gate. "Word's getting around. Crawford's got a lot of folks spooked. She's been knocking on doors, talking about easements and shared property lines. Says this whole area's getting revitalized." "Revitalized," Jackson echoed bitterly. "Sounds like a fancy word for stolen." Harvey gave a grunt of agreement. "You're not wrong. Some folks are starting to see it for what it is. They just don't know what to do about it." Jackson looked at him carefully. "And you? Why are you here?" Harvey shrugged, his face weathered but resolute. "Figured someone ought to stand with the guy who stood up first." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavier than they had any right to be. Jackson felt something shift, subtle but significant. Harvey's presence, his quiet support, was like a crack in the foundation Ellie and CCI had built. For the first time, Jackson realized he wasn't alone. People were watching, waiting, some afraid, but others angry, just like him. "Crawford's days are numbered," Harvey said, looking Jackson square in the eye. "They can't bully everybody forever." Jackson allowed himself a small, grim smile. "We'll see." As Harvey climbed back into his truck and drove away, Kara stepped beside Jackson. "So that's it? You're staying here, waiting for them to come back?" Jackson didn't answer right away. He looked out over the land, the scarred road, the forest that still stood tall despite everything, the house he'd built with his own hands. He could hear the faint chirp of birds returning to the trees, the world waking up as if nothing had happened. "I'm not just waiting," he said finally. "I'm digging in." Kara tilted her head. "What does that mean?" "It means next time they come," Jackson replied, his voice calm, unshakable. "I'll be ready. And I won't be the only one." The sun broke fully over the horizon then, flooding the property with light. It washed over the broken gate, the burn marks in the dirt, the faint smoke rising from the ravine. To anyone else, it might have looked like a war zone, a place defeated and abandoned. But to Jackson Hale, it was something else entirely. It was a warning. And it wasn't for him.